My life often seemed to me like a story that has no beginning and no end. I had the feeling that I was a historical fragment, an excerpt for which the preceding and succeeding text was missing. I could well imagine that I might have lived in former centuries and there encountered questions I was not able to answer, that I had been born again because I had not fulfilled the task given to me.
Erlo van Waveren was a New York philanthropist whose fortune derived from a family of bulb merchants in Amsterdam. He was also a patient and student of Jung's, working with him off and on for 11 years, from 1950 until Jung's death in 1961. His testimony is therefore invaluable for us who know Jung only from his writings. Social taboos sometimes need to be broken if they get in the way of one's personal destiny or obstruct the evolution of consciousness in the collective. Van Waveren broke such taboos twice. He broke a professional taboo by marrying his former New York analyst, allegedly with Jung's blessing. The exception proves the rule. The couple lived happily ever after, joining their inner resources in a shared Jungian practice in New York for over 40 years. Late in life, Van Waveren broke another, this time Jungian taboo, by disclosing in his autobiography a strictly guarded secret, that his personal analysis with Jung had mainly revolved around his past life dreams and visions. To publish Pilgrimage to the Rebirth in the conservative Jungian climate of 1978 was a daring move, but the expected professional outrage never occurred. Instead, Van Waveren's inconvenient truths were conveniently ignored. It is my hope that the growing awareness of reincarnation in the West and the recognition of past life residues in the human psyche by other psychological schools will eventually put an end to this stubborn resistance, and that a new generation of Jungians will finally give Van Waveren the deserved recognition for having broken new ground in a previously unexplored layer of the deep unconscious. Between 1984 and 1985, shortly before Van Waveren's death, the 83-year-old was interviewed by the renowned author, lecturer and historian Olivier Bernier, who was at that time the director of the now defunct N and an Erlo van Waveren Foundation in New York. Bernier was accompanied by a photographer who filmed the interviews, but the film was never finished and was still in this fragmentary state without a title page, beginning or end, when 25 years later, thanks to the helpfulness of my Jungian colleague Dr. Bernice Hill of Boulder, Colorado, a copy was made available to me. I recognized its profound historical importance immediately, but also realized that it needed work before it could be shown to the public. So I took it upon myself to provide the missing pieces and enter into a dialogue with Van Waveren's ideas about reincarnation from my own perspective and experiences as a fellow Jungian working with past life dreams. I had the good fortune to find in Marcelina Martin a creative documentary filmmaker who was able to breathe some visual life into this material. Given that the film consisted of 3 interviews between Van Waveren and Bernier, conducted in different domestic settings over a period of approximately 1 year, it took special skills to pull the pieces together into a unified whole. Van Waveren said in the interviews that with the dawning of the Aquarian Age, the time had finally come to bring the hidden, mystical side of Jung to the surface. He tried to help this revelation along by disclosing previously unknown facts about Jung in this series of charming, intimate interviews. But even though van Waveren correctly foresaw the coming changes in the collective consciousness, he was at least 2 decades ahead of his time. That's why the unfinished film, apart from some peaks by Jungian analysts in Colorado, remained shelved for so long. Only the extraordinary shift in consciousness that we have experienced in the last decade or so could shift this material from a state of potential into one of actualization. Besides, after the recent publication of the Red Book, which was also made possible by this shift in consciousness, people are starting to get used to Jung's mystical side. The proposed format of the film brought to mind the dedication that van Waveren had written in my copy of his book Pilgrimage to the Rebirth. It may have been more than a coincidence that I ran into him and his wife Anne at the secretary's office at the Jung Institute, where his book was for sale because he was one of the Institute's patrons. Van Waveren was very gracious when I asked him to sign a copy of his book, and he patiently heard me out when I told him about having been flooded with past life dreams for several years. He signed my book with a dedication that I would read later in the privacy of my home. On the book's title page, van Waveren had written the words, "Perhaps we will sing a duet." This puzzled me at first. What did he mean by that? But as my past life process began to fan out into my therapeutic practice, and eventually led to the publication of my own book, Past Life Dreamwork, in 2008, this dedication seemed to have been downright prophetic. But now, in this finished film that you are about to see, van Waveren's prophetic words are taking on a whole new meaning, for he and I are literally singing a duet together, although we are not always in tune.
When you first went to Professor Jung, did you feel that while he was clearly a man of great capacities and great learning, did you feel that he was a sort of standard analyst who perhaps knew more than the others but functioned in the same way?
No. There were 2 things. And I told him, I said, "Professor Jung, I don't understand love." And he bent forward and he said, "Shall I tell you something? I don't understand it either." And all of a sudden, I knew I was this big and he was this big. Don't ask me what it was, but the reaction of the unconscious was the immensity I felt, that on all sides he could encompass me. And then later on, I told him, years later in my last conversation, and I said, "Well, Professor, you have always gone ahead of me. And it was wonderful that I had a guide through it all." And he said, "Oh, well," he said, "you didn't have an invisible guru, but I had an invisible guru, and he was my guide." And then he spoke, he said, "I never knew how to take that, but there was an Indian came and gave a lecture at the university in Zurich, and he spoke about his invisible guru. And afterwards I went to him and said, "You mean to say you saw him, but the rest of the people didn't see him?" I said, "That's right." He said, "Who was it?" And he said, "Oh," he said, "my memory is very poor, but it was a 14th century Indian saint. He himself had an older, they only called it Filomene, but I do not know what his name was, but it was a very ancient helper. Very mysterious something, because you can say it was part of his unconscious. But it was not. It was part of the, you can say, of the anima mundi. But when he asked this invisible guru, "What shall I say to my family?" I said, "Well, when you go walk in the woods and you see a deer, you say, 'I saw a deer.' So now you go back to your family and say, 'Well, I saw a guru.'"
You said just now that Professor Jung had an invisible guru, and you said earlier that when you thought of going to Professor Jung, people said, don't do that, he's a mystic. What's that all about?
You know, Anne and I came to Bollingen, which is his private house in the country, and I spoke to Professor Jung and said, Professor Jung, I just read your answer to Job. Why didn't you write all your books like that? And Mrs. Jung said, well, he didn't have a thing to say about it, because it wrote itself, and he had to obey it. And I said then that he really was a mystic, too. He's a mystic. I said, well, if you read Webster's dictionary about a mystic, it's a great compliment. Oh, he said, Webster. Yes, do you know about Webster? I said, yes, well, he was caught with the maid, and he was just giving her a couple of good kisses, and his wife came in. And she said, Webster, I'm surprised. No, my dear, you are amazed. You know, I tell that story because for the world, he had to play one role. He had to be always connected with the rational side of life. And all the irrational part he spoke about, but he didn't dare to go in all that what he knew. He was very psychic. He was extremely sensitive. He was, besides that, he had the memory of an elephant. I can say that because he carried the Buddha spirit too. And he was a combination of two, and you can see in his memory, dreams, and reflections how he speaks about two sides of himself. That which denies, and he said, I have no proof for it, and then he goes on and he says, this is most likely what it is. And so, the word mystic has a very derogative aspect. But I'm a mystic. And the people better get accustomed to it, that there are such things. And a mystic is the one who sees clearer and is more aware of things, can register more in certain ways of the unconscious. Not consciously. Consciously, I can be rated as stupid almost, because I'm not interested in machinery, I'm not interested in anything, but I'm typically one-sided person. I have a very mystical side, which you can read in my book, and I have a very practical side, which I was taught in Holland. And so was Professor Jung also. He had this extremely practical side, which made him a professor, but he never made him a professor in Zurich. We were afraid of him. In the end, he made him full professor in Basel. There they were not so afraid of him. And he was a mystic, but would never allow anyone to say that about him, because he was also a philosopher in the German.
Science is what he wanted to be.
Yes, a Gnostic.
Yes.
He's a true Gnostic. That's what he liked to be called.
Did he feel perhaps that in the specific period in which he was alive, there were attitudes which could not be revealed, things which could not be said, because people were simply not ready to hear them?
Decidedly so. In 1950, I came to him, and we spoke about my former lives and about his former lives. And the next morning, Mrs. Jung came to me at the Institute, and she said, Professor Jung says that you can't say a word about what he told you. No, he was right. because I had had a warning dream also, that even to he was a priest who knew a great deal about psychic phenomena and had experienced a great deal of psychic phenomena. And I wanted to speak with him about former lives, but I got a warning dream that in front of the place where we would meet, there was all of a sudden an iron spike coming out of the ground and tore my whole trousers up. And I knew, some basic attitude will be just shred to pieces by a very nasty something, because the zeitgeist, as it's called, the spirit of the time doesn't allow it. And he speaks about that in his memory and reflections. That there are certain things which cannot be accepted at certain times. And not so long ago I read a book in which the author said, now that at the time of the quantum theory, I dare to write anything, to accept everything, what comes in front of it, if you can explain it or not. But you see, at that time when he lived, you only could accept technically what you could explain, what could be made rational. And this thing like an unseen guru is totally irrational. But it is true.
Once you accepted the quantum theory, you had to be prepared to accept anything that was. Do you think that is the only change in the zeitgeist, or are other changes taking place as well?
There are many changes. The symbol of the Piscean age was two fishes swimming in opposite direction. That means that positive and negative could never meet. They were always rubbing against each other. There was no way of relatedness, the spirit to the matter. There was no relatedness between earth life and spirit life. Now, with the beginning of the Aquarian age, and we are just in the beginning of it. I do not know when. Some say it happened in 1961, some say it will happen 100 or 200 years from now. But there is that the rational and irrational have to relate to each other. The positive and negative have to relate. And then you get consciousness. You see, that's the same as electricity. You see, positive and negative have to come together.
What is the importance of consciousness? Why is it important to make things become conscious?
Well, for the last 2,000 years or more, they thought it was important. And the Greek were the first who said that. Know thyself. And there are a few other people like Shakespeare who who picked it up too. And it is the self-knowledge which brings clarity, awareness of yourself and of the other person. You take in the world, and that puts you in a totally different position towards life. And the Greeks know it. It is one of the main things of philosophy, not of religion.
And even today, in 1984, when you go to Zurich in the summer, there is still, isn't there, a group of people whom you see, whom you've been seeing for many years, and some of whom, at any rate, knew Dr. Jung quite well.
Oh, yes. And that is the wonderful part of it, because we really speak a different language from the newer ones. Also, those we see are now willing to talk very freely. And like Anayala Yaffe, who has written Memory, Dreams and Reflections, and Cornelia Brunner, they made notes of all their conversations. And Jung revealed himself to them. It is not to be found in any of his books. And there are dreams and fantasies and happenings which the Jung family did not want to be published. But they have to be published, because it is a part of his genius which was just cut off. And you think he was a stodgy professor. As Don Tyrrell said, You know, he lies in one place, in the next place he says the very opposite of what he said before. Now, the very opposite was the truth. So he was very clever in maneuvering those two ways, but the family does not want him to be known as anything too special. Well, in those dreams which he revealed to Cornelia Brunner, and he was most open. And one of the analysts in Zurich said, well, why is it that you have those stories and we don't? And she said, well, they wouldn't have believed, you wouldn't have believed him. So why tell it to you? He would also open up that part of his psyche which was called upon. And when you read a book which is out from California, and there are 8 analysts, each writing what they thought about Jung. And one of my friends said there are 8 different characters in that book, because Jung opened up in a different way. He was very universal, but he gave them what was necessary in their world.
It's in your relationship with him, you saw some of that side of him which he did not show most people.
Yes.
Perhaps because he thought they wouldn't understand, or perhaps because he was afraid they would think him a charlatan.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that a little, the sort of things he might have said to you? And
well, he didn't want me to speak about was when he told me that he scolded me. He said, you stay away too much from this earth. You have a long periods in which you don't come back. And he said, I came back every century since the 13th century. And I said, but Professor Jung, don't you ever take a rest? Oh yes, he said, I took 1,000 years from the 13th to the 3rd. But I knew exactly then who he was, because the only outstanding psychologist, you can say, was Zosimos, the great alchemist. And then I figured out, through what Louise von Franz told me, she was exactly the same. She would tell me her former lives, but she would not tell it to other people. No, Marie-Louise von Franz is not right, and Professor Jung was right. Marie-Louise von Franz lives now in the 1980s, and Professor Jung had to convince the Victorian age that there is such a thing as an irrational something, that there is such a thing, and by recognizing it, you can often establish a balance in your patients, which otherwise could not be established. You never get really cured, because life has to bring problem. When life has no problem to solve, then you get a very dull individual and not worthwhile. I think that he was absolutely right by hiding it, but I also remember he said, why did you come to me? And I said to him, well, you suffered more than I did. How do you know? I said, I have read Introduction to the Secrets of the Golden Flower. He said, oh yes, he said, you can read it in between the lines. Funny enough, that the Secret of the Golden Flower had a very magical influence on me. And I remember sitting in this very couch and reading it, rereading it. And I read a sentence which does not exist in the book. And I read, we can reincarnate as long as 300 or 400 years apart, at the most. But those who are very accomplished can make the span 700 years. Now, Professor Jung was 1,000. So I was fascinated by it. And I said, all right, this is page I will mark, page 31. Well, I went back to it, and there's nothing of the kind. Nothing of the kind. My unconscious had just put that in front of me. The same thing happened to Professor Jung in Ravenna. He saw certain things which were just not there. And that always upset Carrie Baines terribly, because he was so unscientific. But his unconscious projected that. It is a way of giving us knowledge which otherwise we cannot.
In the interviews, van Waveren refers to Jung's experience in Ravenna a number of times without going into detail about it. However, because it was a milestone in Jung's discovery of the paranormal, it deserves to be looked at more closely. Jung devoted several pages of memories, dreams, reflections to this incident, which shows how important it had been for him. He had visited the mausoleum of the Roman Empress Galla Placida in Ravenna for the first time in 1913 and had fallen into a strange mood inside the tomb. When he visited the mausoleum again 20 years later, he was overcome by the same uncanny feelings. But on the second visit, the tomb looked different. The room was diffused with a pale blue light, and Jung saw 4 great mosaic frescoes of incredible beauty that he did not remember having seen there before. They all depicted baptism or other water scenes from the Bible. He studied the frescoes for at least 20 minutes together with his travel companion and official mistress, Toni Wolff, who in Memories, Dreams, Reflections is thinly disguised as a female acquaintance. After leaving the mausoleum, they tried to purchase photographs of the frescoes but couldn't find any and were under time pressure to return to Zurich. When Jung later asked the real acquaintance, who was about to visit Ravenna, to bring him back some of these photographs, it turned out that the mosaic frescoes that can be found in the mausoleum did not match the ones that Jung and Toni Wolff had seen. But surprisingly, the ones they had seen had existed some 700 years ago, before the basilica had burned down. They had been commissioned by the Empress Galla Placida for the Basilica of San Giovanni, which she had built as a thanks to God for a safe passage between Byzantium and Ravenna. What Jung found most intriguing about this experience was that he and Toni had seen the same non-existent projected images from another time. In addition to the profound significance of this, it must have been further evidence for Jung that he and Toni had a soul connection that went all the way back to ancient times. But there was more, a lot more, to Jung's experience of the tomb in Ravenna. Following his initial visit to the mausoleum, he had been so identified with the Empress Galla Placida and her fate that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections he called her an embodiment of his anima, instead of calling her what he knew she really was, a past life embodiment of himself. In fact, his whole experience of Italy was so riddled with unconscious past life memories and their potentially explosive trigger points that he never dared to visit Rome itself. When in his old age, in 1949, Jung had tried one more time to visit Rome, he had suffered a fainting spell while buying tickets, which made him give up on that plan once and for all.
The anecdote you told just now about Professor Jung staying away for 1,000 years mentioned earlier lives. Did he speak to that about many people, earlier lives?
No. He was very, very careful. He spoke a great deal about it to Cornelia Brunner, because she brought the material. He spoke a great deal about it to Marie-Louise von France, because she brought the material. You see, there are dreams which we cannot translate. And then we are looking, what could fit. And sometimes the only way it can fit is to take in that it happened in another early life. Now, I once had a dream, in 1938, I remember very well, that I stood on the world on Moscow, and the snow came around me to my feet, and I woke up scared stiff. But it was Moscow, I later on knew. I was most likely the army of Napoleon. And for years I was scared stiff of snow. And Anne would say, well, enjoy it, it is so lovely here in the country. But I couldn't take it. I had to be away from nothing but whites. And that was a back memory of a debacle I experienced. Now I know that one of my great-great-parents died at the Pontresina. No,
Berezina.
Berezina. And, but it was not a memory of my family. I would not have been that scared.
Is that then how you tell, because of the emotional content or the emotional reaction, or one of the ways in which you tell that a dream is referring not to something in your current life, but to something else?
The emotional aspect is terribly important. I know of one case where I said to the girl, you know, you must have been that and that person, because I cannot translate it in any other way. And you say no to any other way I suggest. Well, she accepted it with her mind. Then she drove home, and on the way over, she had to stop the car and weep and weep and weep.
Because it had touched her so deeply.
It had touched her, and you know, we get to know about our former lives only really through that which was not lived, that which could not be digested then, but can be digested now. And it was too much for us at that time to do it. And that is the shadow side of life. And through the shadow side of life, we can really measure if a client or patient was really that former person or not. And it has to be always connected with an emotional reaction, according to my idea.
Between the first interview and the two following ones, as much as a year may have passed. In the latter ones, van Waveren, looking older, was often vague in his statements and experienced more age-related memory lapses. To make things worse, Bernier had asked him in the second interview to speak on a sensitive subject, which, as van Waveren said, he had not had time to prepare himself for. It concerned Jung's former lives. Under pressure and caught off guard, van Waveren disclosed information that was at times ill-considered. Jung himself had been cautious enough not to tell him anything about his own past lives, although he did share some of his past life dreams with him. Based on those shared dreams, the stories that he had heard from Marie-Louise von Franz and Cornelia Brunner, and his own knowledge of history, van Waveren speculated about Jung's past lives, convinced that he had them all figured out. In my opinion, however, some of his conclusions present scanty evidence, are based too much on hearsay, and contain too many archetypal projections to be convincing. Because of his powerful projections, van Waveren seemed incapable of seeing Jung in any role other than that of a global leader and teacher. That's not how reincarnation works, not in my experience. The opposites that van Waveren observed in some of his own former lives assert themselves for everyone in the reincarnational cycle. We oscillate between prominent and insignificant lives, good and evil ones, rich and poor ones, and we're born into different races, religions, and genders. In Jung's case, this meant that several lifetimes spent in a leadership role would have been balanced out by lives as a follower of a leader. The Oversoul seems to explore the three-dimensional world from all possible angles in order to complete the gestalt of a particular line of interest that it pursues lifetime after lifetime. For all the reasons stated above, I thought that it would lend more substance to the film if we amplified some parts of the interview with Jung's own unconscious material and eliminated other parts where van Waveren, in my opinion, gets carried away by overblown fantasies.
This is a difficult and a confidential subject, but could you talk a little about what you know of Professor Jung's incarnations?
I thought we would do that at another time, but if this is a new record. In 1950, I came to Professor Jung. I had sent a message before that with Gary Baines, who went to see Professor Jung, if he believed in reincarnation. And he had told then a dream, which later on he put in Memory, Dreams and Reflections, which there was this row of knights, and on the tomb, the last one, there was still life in the little finger, and it was moving.
The dream of the row of tombs that Jung had sent van Waveren in answer to the question of whether or not he believed in reincarnation was actually misquoted in the interview. It was not a row of knights that Jung had seen in his dream, but a row of mummified corpses, the identities of which he did not elaborate on, except for the last one in the row, whom he called a crusader. This is a very important distinction because the dead, one from each century, represented Jung's past life history. Because this dream, which dated back to 1913, had been so crucial for Jung's understanding of the psychological aspects of reincarnation and of his own past life history, we are presenting it here in full.
I was in a region like the Alleskamps near Arles. There they have a lane of sarcophagi which go back to Merovingian times. In the dream I was coming from the city and saw before me a similar lane with a long row of tombs. There were pedestals with stone slabs on which the dead lay. They reminded me of old church burial vaults where knights in armor lay outstretched. Thus the dead lay in my dream, in their antique clothes, with hands clasped, the difference being that they were not hewn out of stone, but in a curious fashion mummified. I stood still in front of the first grave and looked at the dead man, who was a person of the 1830s. I looked at his clothes with interest, whereupon he suddenly moved and came to life. He unclasped his hands, but that was only because I was looking at him. I had an extremely unpleasant feeling, but walked on and came to another body. He belonged to the 18th century. There exactly the same thing happened. When I looked at him, he came to life and moved his hands. So I went down the whole row until I came to the 12th century, that is, to a crusader in chainmail who lay there with clasped hands. His figure seemed carved out of wood. For a long time I looked at him and thought he was really dead. But suddenly I saw that the finger of his left hand was beginning to stir slightly.
Jung's own comment on this dream in Memory Streams Reflections was that it had taught him that such contents are not dead, outmoded forms, but part of the living psyche. He also said that it had led him over the years to his theory of the archetypes. What he chose not to disclose in Memory Streams Reflections, but conveyed to van Waveren, is that before this dream became a cornerstone of his archetypal theory, it had provided him with eye-opening information about his own past life history. When he said to van Waveren, "I came back every century from the 13th century on," this dream was clearly in the back of his mind. From my own experience as a past life therapist working with dreams, I would call this a past life overview dream, because it is taking the dreamer from one lifetime to another. This type of dream is very rare, but somewhat typical of the end of the reincarnational cycle. Before closing its last chapter in the Book of Life, the Oversoul goes into a mode of synthesis where it initiates a comprehensive past life review. This may include many past life dreams, flashbacks, and visions. I like to compare this past life overview to the life review of the dying, because analogous to what could be called a little death at the end of this life, there is a big death awaiting us at the end of the reincarnational cycle.
He was a teacher, always was. Also knew that by my own series, how different a role he had always played from myself, how much more to the point and how much less worldly he was, but much more the wisdom aspect. He was not willing ever to tell me who he was, and I didn't want to ask him, but I could figure it out very easily. I noticed that the people whom he used in his teachings and whom he had to write about were all former lives of his. And the first one I recognized was Paracelsus. I figured out that for 1,000 years before that, he must have been Zosimos, because Zosimos was the first one of the great alchemists, and the alchemists was really his great task to define their ideas and their importance. Paracelsus was a great alchemist, but also a great doctor. Then I heard from several sources that he might have been Goethe, because he used that in his house in Bollingen of Faustus, with apologies to Faustus.
There's plenty of evidence in Jung's own unconscious material that he was indeed a reincarnation of Goethe. For instance, Jung's dream of the row of tombs contains a hidden clue that Goethe was the first dead man he encountered. Goethe was the one whose clothes Jung studied without telling us what he saw, and whose time of death he specified as having been in the 1830s, a generation before Jung was born. This specific date, the only one given in this dream, raises a red flag for anyone versed in German literature. Goethe, who had towered over the German literary scene since the second half of the 18th century, died in the 1830s, in 1832 to be precise. Also, many of you will remember from Memories, Dreams, Reflections that Jung, as a child, felt that he had two different identities. One of a schoolboy who had trouble with algebra and was not sure of himself on the one hand, and the other of a man of great importance, a high authority, someone not to be trifled with. This second self had first appeared to Jung when he was living with his parents in Kleinhüningen. It was an old man, at least in the eyes of a child, who lived in the 18th century, wore buckled shoes and a white wig, and travelled in a green horse-drawn carriage. I always thought this was Goethe in formal dress on his way to the court of the Grand Duke Karl August of Saxe-Weimar, whose privy councillor Goethe was. Jung also tells in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that as a schoolchild he would often write the date 1786 instead of 1886 by mistake, and then be overcome by an inexplicable nostalgia. In 1786, Goethe embarked on his famous Italian journey, which he had dreamt of doing all his life. Traveling in a horse-drawn carriage like the man Jung had seen in his childhood vision, Goethe stayed in Italy for 2 full years. He later published his diary of these longed-for, life-changing years in Italy. Unfortunately, though, Goethe, who believed in reincarnation, never went to Ravenna. It would have been interesting to know what kind of frescoes he might have seen inside the tomb. Where interest, knowledge, and genius are concerned, Jung and Goethe were each other's match. Goethe had the same universal mind as Jung, and was like him, a philosopher and a scientist, in addition to being a writer and poet. What makes the link even stronger is that, according to a family legend, Jung was also a biological descendant of the great man. It was virtually an established fact in his family that his maternal grandfather was Goethe's illegitimate or natural son. This Jung mentions twice in Memories, Dreams, Reflections.
The first inclination that I knew that he played the role of the Buddha Gautama, was when I read in Memory, Dreams and Reflections that he had very great experiences in India. And he did not write about the fact, which he told later on to Cornelia Brunner, that when he came to the grave of Gautama, the Buddha, he was taken by uncontrollable weeping for 15 minutes and had to remove himself because he was in absolute hysteria. Those things happen when that unlived life comes up and the sacrifice of the life. And the recognition, and his recognition, that he played that role also.
This is a good example of how van Waveren, when he did have authentic insider information, tended to go overboard with his archetypal projections. Powerful emotional reactions to certain places are indeed a telltale sign that a person may have lived there before, but these emotions are not necessarily restricted to feelings of grief. I myself have visited several of my past life places of origin, and my emotional reaction to them has been different each time. In some places, I felt uplifted and at peace. In others, I have cried a whole day long because I was re-experiencing old emotional pain. Therefore, I would have taken Jung's uncontrollable weeping as a sign that he had been a personal disciple of the Buddha and was reliving the grief he had felt at his guru's passing. Van Waveren, however, typically concluded that Jung must have been the Buddha himself. It did not occur to him that, psychologically or spiritually, this did not make any sense. For why would the enlightened Gautama Buddha, who had achieved a state of freedom from all human attachments, be shedding tears at his own grave in a much later incarnation? Moreover, why would he even have reincarnated at all? There are also manifestations of Jung's preoccupation with reincarnation and liberation from further rebirths in the Red Book. In this painting from the Liber Secundus, Jung captured the relationship between his many incarnations and his greater self. On the left-hand side of the picture is a mandala with rainbow-colored rays streaming in all directions. On the right-hand side of the mandala is a multitude of predominantly male faces. Their individual features are more pronounced in the vicinity of the mandala and become more and more blurred with increasing distance from it, until at the outer edge of the painting the faces are reduced to mere skulls. The mandala is flower-shaped, and in that resembles the golden flower in the ancient Taoist text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, which Jung years later wrote the introduction for, and which van Waveren repeatedly refers to. I will return to this Taoist text later in connection with a third interview. For the moment, suffice it to say that to obtain a vision of the golden flower is the ultimate goal of this secret Taoist meditation practice, which aims at liberation from further rebirths. Jung might have had this Taoist symbol in mind when he painted the flower, because the text in the Red Book which accompanies the painting deals with the same esoteric subject, liberation from the cycle of rebirth. In this text, Jung carries on a dialogue with the Kabiri. The Kabiri were mystery gods, so sacred that in ancient times their name could not be uttered by the uninitiated. They were revered throughout the Mediterranean area, particularly on the island of Samothrake. In the second part of Goethe's Faust, the Kabiri are summoned to help Homunculus, a lab-produced human mannequin who is confined to a glass vial, to become fully incarnate. In order to be properly born, Homunculus must break the vial at the throne of Aphrodite, spill his fire into the ocean, and begin life again at the very bottom of the evolutionary ladder. Just as in Goethe's Faust, the Kabiri in the Red Book are agents of evolution. They identify themselves as the master builders of the lower nature. When Jung asks them what kind of work they do, they reply, "We haul things up, we build. We place stone upon stone. Now you stand on solid ground." But even as master builders of the lower nature, they recognize Jung as their master. They challenge him to grow beyond the evolutionary process they are keeping in motion. They even hand him a sword and urge him to kill them by cutting through the knots and entanglements in his brain. They say to him, "He who wishes to conquer new land needs to bring down the bridges behind him." When Jung brings down those bridges by killing the Kabiri, he sets foot on new ground. He becomes the sole owner of the tower that the Kabiri built in thousands of years of painstaking labor. Nothing brought up should flow back, writes Jung, meaning that nothing he has made conscious should ever become unconscious again. This is a strong statement, considering that unconscious material that has been made conscious has a natural tendency to fall into the unconscious again. But there's an even stronger statement to follow. Jung writes, "Just as a tower surmounts the summit of a mountain on which it stands, so I stand above my brain from which I grew." When Jung put the Kabiri to the sword, he cut through all the complexes and karmic entanglements that keep us tied to the earth plane. Yet having built his tower from the lower and upper beyond, which are poetic terms for the personal and collective unconscious, he is still curious about what might have eluded him. He therefore asked the serpent of the beyond, presumably the Kundalini, to dive into the beyond for him once again. After some initial resistance, the Kundalini does what he asks her to do and brings up the image of a plain ugly man with a contorted face and who poisoned his wife and was hanged for it. This seems to be a past life from the shadow side of Jung's reincarnational history and not one of the exemplary lives of world leadership that van Waveren exclusively attributed to Jung. So perhaps not all of Jung's entanglements were cut by this act of bravery, at least not all the karmic ones, and he still had to pay the piper for poisoning his wife in a previous incarnation. In any event, he still had plenty of time in his present life as Carl Jung to rectify this transgression, for when he made this entry into the Red Book, he was only in his late 30s.
I then started to know who I was around the time of Christ, and not only what I wrote in the book, but what I have always hidden was that I had several lives at that time. And I knew that I was closely connected to Jesus of Nazareth. In my book I said the truth, but I also hid the truth because I didn't know what would be. I take this opportunity, and it will be very hard for those who are listening to me, and for myself. I took on several roles around the Christ, and I'm willing today to speak about two of them. It was Peter and Paul, both. You see, Peter was a very strong fisherman, but you can see from the incarnations before that he would be that strong something, and he had to follow the Christ. I relived part of the things of the Bible. I relived several of the experiences of it, and I have written about that. And Paul, on the way to Damascus, was not met by Christ Jesus. It was his own Christ that made him blind. You see, Jesus of Nazareth had opened the road. And so after that, people could contact their own Christ principle. I do not know what at this moment I could say more about it, because I was not prepared. I thought it would be another day that we would speak about it, but all of a sudden my unconscious didn't refuse. I think, you see, by taking on the role of Professor Jung this time, and he started what he finished what he started and opened up the New Age. I mean, and is that greater soul? I mean, you could sense it in his presence. Not always, because he had his shadow side also, and then he was a regular bear who took the honey out of the tree and then just left.
We've talked before about earlier lives in sequence over a period of time, but isn't it possible for several lives to occur simultaneously?
Yes, it is. In The Secret of the Golden Flower, you have a very good picture of it. You see, the Buddha is there in the middle, and there are 5 emanations of other Buddhas. And I was very astonished to see it. But then when I was in India, there was a professor, and I asked him the same question. He said, yes, you can influence 5 different lives from the very center of you.
5 simultaneous lives?
5 simultaneous, yes.
And is there then some sort of a pattern to it? I mean, why choose simultaneous lives rather than consecutive lives? Do those simultaneous lives relate to one another?
Well, you know, I had a marvelous example of that with Fénelon. Fénelon was a very holy man, and he was just so precise and had all the court manners and all of that. And when I was writing about him, all of a sudden I had a dream in which a totally different figure came up with his full name, and I looked him up in his encyclopedia, and he was a rascal. He was a womanizer, he was a real bon vivant, and the funny part of it all, he was trying to make love to my great-great-great-grandmother, who had at that time an affair with Louis XIV. And Louis XIV was furious and sent him away from the court. You have to have a balance. You see, those extreme lives are really sort of sacrifices. And it is as if the soul has a human quality, and it has to balance it off so that you are not just pure spirit, but that another part of you can really participate in earth life.
Why a sacrifice? What is it that you're giving up when you have those extreme lives?
Well, I call it a sacrifice because they have a message, and that message has to be fulfilled at the cost of everything. And there is no choice, and there is no room often for a personal life. Fénelon was the priest all over. There's a sacrifice. He was, although he was very charming and all of that, but he was a charming priest, and the priest always had the upper hand.
Is it possible in cases like that, where the soul is split, so to speak, between different lives, is it possible to know it at the time, or is it something which only becomes clear after, well, many years have passed?
According to my dreams, I know most of the fellows who are of my own soul, and I know them or about them from my dreams, who have told me very exactly, now he belonged to it, and he belonged to it, and she might belong to it. And it is very difficult, the idea of belonging to the same unit.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it is. And you must take the idea of the self as a unit, as a mandala. Jung would say, you must take it like your hands. You do not know that the little finger is connected with the thumb. But they are, and they all have their different functions. And I think that is the basic outer expression. The 5 lives is the 5 different aspects of our soul. Perhaps there are even 10, I do not know. If there's a logos and eros life at the same time, I don't have enough proof of that. I have just an idea that that might be.
But you know when, at earlier periods, you had simultaneous lives, but since it's happened before, it might be happening now. And would you know?
Yes, I know them.
Oh.
And I'm always very close to them. The thing is that you have to watch out not to get too close, because then one takes on an identification with the other and doesn't fulfill his own role. And I have one example in particular. I know that we were very close, we embraced the first time we saw, and later on he wrote about it that the traffic between us was terrific. But then he fled because he wasn't strong enough to hold on to his own. In the last 2,000 years, you will find, for instance, Thomas à Becket and his king. They were two parts of one soul, very close together. And really, you can say almost in love with each other. And the fact is that one often had to kill or try to kill the other one, so that the soul would know what is more important, the earth aspect or the spirit aspect.
So that when Henry II killed Becket, then presumably the earth aspect won out.
Say it again.
When Henry II killed Becket, or had
Yes.
Becket killed, then the earth aspect, I presume, won out.
Yes, decidedly so. And you know, he couldn't forget it. I just followed him, because he had killed part of himself, and he knew it. And on account of that, he did all kinds of things to atone.
And then what happens? Time passes and there are new lives. Do you then try to make up for having killed part of yourself in an earlier life? Is there some sort of balance later on? Some sort of new completeness?
I never thought of that. But the word balance I like. Yes, there must be a balance. But you know, the age of the fishes was very imbalanced. It was not that you could relate. The fishes went into opposite direction. And I do not know that under certain circumstances you can balance it, but there are other circumstances which absolutely forbid you to balance it. You have to carry that in your unconscious. And I have no particular answer to that. But I think that now, in the Aquarian age, we are making up for a lot of what we couldn't do in the Piscean age. That I believe.
So that questions left unresolved can now be resolved and imbalances can now be rectified.
When you have developed enough.
Yes.
Yes.
With the change from the Piscean to the Aquarian age, it is not only the capacity for redeeming or cleaning up earlier lives that has changed, but also clearly the kind of standards that were imposed by the earlier age are changing also. In what way are they changing?
In what way
Are they changing? Where are we going to?
I think, you see, it is very interesting that the star of Pluto was surmised in the beginning of 1800, and they found it later on. Now, Pluto brings us in touch with the deepest part of the unconscious, and there we hide our guilt and our unhappinesses and our undigested life. And we can now, on account of that new condition, we can really balance off and experience that what we could not experience for the last 2,000 years.
The only picture in The Secret of the Golden Flower that could have given van Waveren the idea of 5 simultaneous incarnations is actually not a representation of the Buddha as he thought, but that of a Chinese adept in the 4th and final stage of the secret meditation technique revealed in these Taoist teachings. As previously stated, the goal of this meditation is to liberate the adept from the yoke of further rebirth. The 5 emanations which arise from the fiery aura of the meditating adept and fan out into 30 more emanations represent altogether the Taoist principle of the one in the many. In addition, it could be a stylization of a highly evolved meditative state where from the inner void images of previous incarnations along with the image of the golden flower or the greater self appear. I was told by a Buddhist that there are 5 so-called Buddha families, but they represent 5 different aspects of the Buddha and not 5 simultaneous incarnations of him. Therefore, the validation which van Waveren believed to have received from the holy man in India might have been based on a misunderstanding. His theory of the 5 simultaneous incarnations is certainly not supported by my own experience, nor does it tally with the findings of other past life therapists. All we have evidence of is occasional dual and sometimes even triple incarnations. For instance, one of my clients dreamt of a past life container with a clay form in it, which kept changing shape and color according to God's command. Usually it had only one head, but sometimes it had 3. My client knew that the 3 heads represented 3 simultaneous incarnations in his past life history. I've come across dual incarnations in my own past life history over which I happen to have an unusually broad overview. After listing 47 past lives in chronological order, it became clear that since the 19th century I must have had several dual lives in succession. Just like van Waveren's multiple incarnations, my dual lives were opposites. They oscillated between extreme wealth and destitute poverty in parallel male and female incarnations. But contrary to van Waveren's multiple incarnations, my dual ones lived in different parts of the world and never met each other. The love-hate relationships between them and the interference with and killing of each other that van Waveren is talking about could therefore not occur. I wonder if some of the cases he mentions are multiple incarnations at all, or rather individuals incarnating together in order to clear karma from other lifetimes. I would think that the Oversoul in its infinite wisdom would go to any lengths to keep these sibling souls apart so that they can live out their individual life plan unimpeded. The most effective way of doing that would be to create geographical distance between them. And all the dual lives I ever encountered were separated from each other in this way. I have also made the observation that dual lives often only partly overlap. Whenever an individual life was in decline, through sickness, old age, or other adverse circumstances, the next life had already gained a foothold on the earth plane. For such a partial overlap of dual incarnations, my present life can serve as an example. I only learned about the former existence of a soul sister 3 years ago when I had a mind-bending dream for which there is no other explanation. The first thing I saw in my dream was a white delivery van, which was parked in front of the entrance to a Jewish cemetery. Then I received a download of information, most of which I remembered when I awoke. The year was 1936, and the cemetery where the van was parked was located near Tübingen in southern Germany. A young Jewish woman lawyer named Hanna Wolpert had been arrested by the Gestapo for being a member or the founder of a local organization. In my dream I knew the name of the organization, but remembered only fragments of it when I awoke. Hanna Wolpert had held a position as the assistant in the law department of Tübingen University before all Jewish state employees were forced into retirement. She was married to a non-Jew, which for racial reasons was frowned upon by the Nazis. In my dream I had been aware of a negative turn of events that had occurred the year before, which had precipitated Hannah's arrest. Only later did I find out that this had been the passage of the notorious Nuremberg laws in 1935, which had imposed severe restrictions on the Jewish population. According to these laws, Jews were prohibited from marrying non-Jews, and extramarital sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews were considered a crime. In addition, Jews were no longer allowed to hold public office or to study at German universities. Hannah must have been in conflict with one of these new laws, because after being cross-examined by the Gestapo, she was loaded into the white delivery van and driven to the Jewish cemetery, where she was executed by a shot in the back of her neck. Her body was then dumped inside the entrance of the cemetery. When I woke up, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my neck, as if I were Hannah Wolpert myself. In 1936, the year Hannah died, I was 3 years old, an only child living with my parents in Berlin. Therefore, I could not possibly be a reincarnation of Hannah. At first, I did not recognize Wolpert as a Jewish name, until a Google search taught me otherwise. The surname Wolpert, although not exclusively Jewish, is of Ashkenazi origin. The geographical area in Germany where the name is most common happens to be the southern state of Baden-Württemberg, where Tübingen is located. I also found academic connections online between the Wolpert family and Tübingen University. These post hoc discoveries all underscored the veracity of my dream, and I began to take it as a given that my soul sister had been murdered by the Gestapo when I was 3 years old. The only way I could deal with this emotionally was by processing Hannah's fate as my own. This must have made a difference in the quantum field, because I dreamt during this process that I had lit hundreds of votive candles inside the entrance to the Jewish cemetery where her body had been sacrilegiously dumped. The recognition of this dual incarnation explained to me an irrational decision I had made after graduating from high school. I had been all set to study law, when after my first lecture at Frankfurt University I had abruptly dropped that plan. It also explained the deep connection I've had with Jewish people for most of my life. On the other hand, it raised as many questions as it answered. The question that has been foremost in my mind is how Hannah's execution might have affected my early childhood development. Her death had coincided with a crucial age when children begin to assert themselves. I wonder if it had broken my spirit and rendered me helpless vis-à-vis my overpowering parents, who did not always have my best interest at heart. What if I had received the telepathic message from Hannah when she died? Don't stand up for yourself or they will kill you. In my childhood I had no physical defenses against infectious diseases of any kind and was sick in bed all the time. When I was in my 40s, my English analyst pointed out that I was lacking a psychological defense system. Thanks to the work I've done on myself, this is no longer the case. But I will never stop wondering what kind of person I might have become if Hannah had not paid with her life for standing up for her God-given rights. It is remarkable that in all 3 interviews karma is never mentioned, although according to Jung the concept of karma is inseparable from that of reincarnation. Towards the end of the last interview, Bernier tries to broach the subject in an impersonal, non-threatening way by asking von Waveren if he believed that King Henry II, after having Thomas Becket murdered, would have to atone for that treacherous act in another life. Van Waveren replies that he had never thought of that before, which I found rather surprising. He must have had at least some inkling of karma when he wrote in his book that in his 13th century life as Archbishop Walter de Grey, thrice regent of England, he read 3 black masses in order to gain power over the young king Henry III. Van Waveren said that fortunately his black masses had not had the desired effect, but they had haunted him and he had painfully lived it out. Did he mean in his life as Peter de Grey or in subsequent lifetimes? I wonder if he was aware of the long-term karmic consequences of black magic. From my own past life history and that of some of my clients, I know that black magic, as well as other forms of spiritual power abuse, carry the heaviest karmic penalty of them all. They cast a dark shadow over many lifetimes to come, and some of us, at some point of our long journey through the ages, have messed up our future prospects in this way. Karma is the great equalizer in the reincarnational cycle. It unites the opposites by making sure that what goes around comes around. It can be the long arm of justice that will catch up with us in the end, or a moral compass that will help us stay on the straight and narrow. As a past life therapist, what I like about karma is that it kicks us out of our long-suffering victim mode and returns our disowned power to us. That can be even more healing than the uncovering of past life trauma itself. At the end of the last interview in 1985, Van Waveren and Bernier appear confident that in the upcoming Aquarian age, imbalances will be more easily redressed and previous wrongs rectified. But having survived the ending of the Mayan calendar, humanity is still not better off. Life seems even more out of balance, and instead of rectifying previous wrongs, we're piling new wrongs on the old ones. Yes, time seems to be speeding up, which might also increase the speed by which karma gets addressed and resolved. But that only intensifies the painfulness of this process instead of making it easier for us. Personally, I don't believe that we can spirit karma away with meditation, mantras, and theories of instant global enlightenment. Karma can only be resolved by accepting the consequences of our actions, by living a life of service, and by avoiding the trap of repetition compulsion carried over from other lifetimes. I tend to agree with Jung, who seemed to have this very issue in mind when he wrote in The Secret of the Golden Flower.
Obviously, the veil of Maya cannot be lifted by a mere decision of reason, but demands a most thoroughgoing and wearisome preparation, consisting in the right payment of all debts of life. For as long as one is in any way held by the domination of cupiditas, the veil is not lifted and the heights of consciousness, empty of contents and free of illusion, are not reached. Nor can any trick nor any deceit bring it about.